series of Crossing Borders, Women Writing Their Lives. I'm Jody Lisberger. I'm director of the Women's Studies program here and also a published writer. And I am immensely pleased to have today the opportunity to introduce Nancy McCabe. But before I introduce Nancy, let me make just a few announcements and some thanks. I hope you will put on your calendars the last of our Crossing Borders Women Writing Their Lives events, which is April 12th, same time, same place. Beth Taylor, who is the co-director of the writing program at Brown, will be here reading from and talking about her book, The Plain Language of Love and Loss. Like Jill Conway, Elaine Orr, and Nancy McCabe, Beth has also courageously crossed borders in her experience, in her case, growing up a Quaker, in a Quaker family during the Vietnam War and facing the suicide of her 14-year-old brother who was being harassed by Boy Scouts for not participating in the militaristic activities of the time. So I hope you will put that on your calendar and that you will go to the URI website and the Women's Studies website events and click on her book when you can also get an excerpt. So I know many of you are taking advantage of that. There will be books then, and there are also books today. Both Nancy's book, her forthcoming book isn't out yet, but Meeting Sophie, Nancy will be delighted not only to answer questions at the end of her talk, but also to sign books. We also have some Gods of Noonday. I know some of you from the last event couldn't purchase Gods of Noonday because the publishers had published it upside down. Always very interesting. Let me also remind you to pick up 2 flyers on your way out the door today. If you want a summation of our events, here is our Crossing Borders and a little bit of background about Beth's book. As well, I do want to remind you of an opportunity to join with kindred writers this summer at the 5th Ocean State Summer Writing Conference, June 23rd to 25th. This is an opportunity for everyone, writers at all levels, to partake of, some incredible workshops, one-on-one opportunities, panels, readings, and we have some very prominent writers who are coming: Robert Stone, Jennifer Egan, Tomas Salomon. So please be on the lookout for this sign up to register. I think students get a better price than, do students get a different price? If you sign up for a creative writing course this summer, to take a creative writing course, you are automatically included in the conference. So I highly recommend that you sign up to take a creative writing course this summer. Let me see. I need to give my thanks. As always, it takes a little time, forgive me, but there's no way I could do what I do without the help of many people, and I feel it's important to recognize them. So let me thank, first of all, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities for their grant, Sue Ellen Kroll for her help in doing that, the Honors Program. Come on in. Jan, come on in. Hi, Jade, how are you? Come on in and have a seat. The Honors Program, Rick McIntyre and Deb Gardner, Dean Winnie Brownell from the College of Arts and Sciences, Lynn McKinney and the College of Human Science and Services, Lynn Derbyshire in Communication Studies, Psychology, Writing and Rhetoric, Sociology and Anthropology, Marie Schwartz, who's chair of the History Department, has contributed. I want to thank the people who work with me in my office, Deb Messner, Jen Brandt, Erica Munoz. I want to thank Gail Skidmore and Liz Shunke from the URI Bookstore and Printing, who are incredible fans of writers and give their support wholeheartedly. I want to thank my partner, Mike Yefko, without whom I could never do what I do. And as always, I want to thank our students for keeping us guessing and thinking and daring to speak the truth. So thank you. Now to the pleasure of introducing Nancy McCabe. If you have read any of her essays, I need to clarify one thing. I am not the Jody who gives her tap dance lessons. And I'm not any other Jody. I didn't tour with her in China. So it is pure coincidence that my name happens to be Jody, but I don't want you to think I'm going to break out in a song and dance here. Nancy is an associate professor and director of the writing program at the University of Pittsburgh in Bradford. She has a PhD and an MFA. She is a writer, a prize-winning writer of creative nonfiction, poetry, and fiction. She has 2 published books so far. One is called After the Flashlight Man, a memoir of awakening. So that can tell you a little bit about her humor and who she is. And her second book was Meeting Sophie, a memoir of adoption. Her forthcoming book will be coming out from the University of Missouri Press in September, we hope, and it is called Crossing the Blue Willow Bridge, A Journey to My Daughter's Birthplace in China. And I definitely hope I will let you know if you'd like to know when it comes out. Nancy has been published in the most prestigious journals, whether it's Prairie Schooner, Bellingham Review, Gulf Coast, Hayden Ferry Review, or the Massachusetts Review, or countless others. She is a highly recognized and awarded writer. She has received 1 pushcart and many, many nominations, and she's also been given 4 honorable mentions in the Best American collections of essays. And that means that she wasn't one of the top 100 writers in the world, or she wasn't one of the top 15 writers chosen. She was only one of the top 115 writers in the world. So, you know, how upsetting. So I am thrilled to have Nancy here. She is such a talented writer. We talk about this event as being crossing borders. She has crossed borders in many, many ways. Her bravery, perhaps, to adopt a child from China as a single mother, her bravery to travel through China, her bravery to do what she knows she wanted to do and to write extremely honestly about it. As a writer, she shows her agency, her voice, her refusal to keep silent about things that women in telling their stories must never keep silent about. She's funny, insightful, incredibly talented, and I feel we are very lucky to have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Nancy McCabe.
Thank you, Jody.
You're welcome.
Okay, let me see if I can manage this microphone without clunking it to the ground at some point here. I asked Jody what she wanted me to talk about, and she said, well, I want you to talk about crossing borders, women writing their lives, which I find to be a very intimidating title. Great title. But I guess the first thing that I thought of when I heard the title was the feeling that I've always had that writing creative nonfiction is a sort of crossing of boundaries for me, because I started out as a fiction writer, and I was always planning to write novels. I never would have imagined myself writing memoirs, and particularly not memoirs about adoption, especially not 2 of them. When I first started writing, I much preferred the disguises of fiction. Even when what I was writing was autobiographical, I could say, oh, it's just a story I made up. So, you know, it's a lot safer to write fiction in some ways. In other ways, not so much. But what was happening is I wrote fiction for many years, and in many cases was using very autobiographical material. When I was young, I wrote a story about a 20-year-old who honeymooned in the Lily Tomlin Shrine Room of Rosalie's Hotel in downtown Harper, Kansas, and questions her ill-conceived marriage and her whole existence. I wrote another story about a woman's terrifying encounter with a man in the middle of the night who wakes her up in her bedroom by shining a flashlight in her eyes. And then I wrote another story about a... Thank you, Jody.
You're welcome.
Okay, let me see if I can manage this microphone without clunking it to the ground at some point here. I asked Jody what she wanted me to talk about, and she said, well, I want you to talk about crossing borders, women writing their lives, which I find to be a very intimidating title. Great title. But I guess the first thing that I thought of when I heard the title was the feeling that I've always had that writing creative nonfiction is a sort of crossing of boundaries for me, because I started out as a fiction writer, and I was always planning to write novels. I never would have imagined myself writing memoirs, and particularly not memoirs about adoption, especially not 2 of them. When I first started writing, I much preferred the disguises of fiction. Even when what I was writing was autobiographical, I could say, oh, it's just a story I made up. So, you know, it's a lot safer to write fiction in some ways. In other ways, not so much. But what was happening is I wrote fiction for many years, and in many cases was using very autobiographical material. When I was young, I wrote a story about a 20-year-old who honeymooned in the Lily Tomlin Shrine Room of Rosalie's Hotel in downtown Harper, Kansas, and questions her ill-conceived marriage and her whole existence. I wrote another story about a woman's terrifying encounter with a man in the middle of the night who wakes her up in her bedroom by shining a flashlight in her eyes. And then I wrote another story about a burnout crisis counselor who has what feels like a psychic experience. But none of those stories felt like they were entirely working, and I couldn't figure out why. But I remembered something that Tobias Wolff, who's a pretty well-known writer of both fiction and creative nonfiction, said when he visited my workshop at the University of Arkansas many years ago. He said that he wrote fiction when he wanted to take real events and dramatize them, when he wanted to make stuff up. And he said he wrote creative nonfiction when what really happened was dramatic enough. So I started thinking about that, and I realized that my stories were not only more interesting, but they made more sense when I admitted that they were things that had really happened. When I admitted that I was a 20-year-old in the Lily Tallman Shrine Room, a place that became even more bizarre and surreal, and less a seemingly strangely placed symbolic element, when it was clear that it wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was a real place. I was actually the woman who encountered the flashlight man in the middle of the night in my bedroom, and I was also the exhausted domestic abuse counselor who woke in the night at the moment a neighbor's husband set her bed on fire. So I said, you know, maybe I need to write about what really happened. I ran across a quote by Mimi Schwartz, who says, if your story is really about Mom in Iowa, why turn her into a half-sister in New York, unless in the transformation you tap into the real story you need to tell. So what I realized was that fiction was pulling me away from the stories that I needed to tell. And furthermore, the driving forces behind those stories wasn't really the kind of embedded conflict that drives fiction, but a quest to understand my experience. So casting those stories as fiction was sort of like observing them through gauze. When I stripped that away and addressed what really happened and why it had happened, it restored the drama that fiction had pretty much drained away. But it was still a kind of difficult decision for me to switch to writing creative nonfiction because that idea of exposure is really kind of scary. It's like saying this is me and this really happened to me, you know. Ugh. And then, of course, nonfiction gets a kind of bad reputation. If you read reviews of memoirs, say in the New York Times Book Review, there are very few that do not mention the stereotype of creative nonfiction writers, particularly memoir writers, as navel-gazers. And when you write creative nonfiction, there's always going to be someone who says, oh, I'm so sorry for you. What a terrible life you've lived. Or just looks at you like, wow, you're really weird. So I had this student who sat in on one of my classes. She was an older woman, a community member, and she wanted to write memoir. And she wrote this beautiful, beautiful stuff. And I knew that she wanted to continue writing after the class, and I knew some people in the community who wanted to set up a writing group, so I got them together, and I attended the first couple meetings to help them get going. And at one point, the group decided to do a prompt related to their relationships with their grandmothers. So they all wrote these paragraphs about their grandmothers. And my former student, Kim, did the same thing, and everybody was going around reading their paragraphs about their grandmothers, and all the paragraphs were about how warm and cozy and wonderful their grandmothers were, about how their freshly baked cookies and their wonderful powdery smells and their comforting words. And Kim read hers, and it was this beautiful scene about setting the table and her grandmother being critical of her, and it was so complex, and you got a sense of this real relationship, you know, one that was both loving and conflicted in many ways, a real relationship. And people in the group said to her, oh, we're so sorry that you had such a bad relationship with your grandmother. And I thought, oh my gosh, they're going to ruin her. They're not getting it. She's the one that's being honest. She's the one that's telling the truth about her relationship with her grandmother. She obviously loved her grandmother. It wasn't that, you know. I mean, but there were conflicts like there are in every relationship. And I think that that's kind of a something that we all run into in writing creative nonfiction, that there's always going to be somebody who says, I'm so sorry you had a bad relationship with your grandmother, when really you think you're just telling the truth and being honest. Certainly, my books, every now and then somebody will post something on Amazon like about meeting Sophie. Someone posted something like, well, this writer has very unusual views. Or you know, somebody will say, well, she's really different. And we all know what that means when somebody says, that's different, which means that's really weird. Okay? There's definitely some judgment implied in that. At one time, I bought into the idea, of course, when I was a fiction writer, I totally believed that fiction writers were artists and memoir writers were exhibitionists. When I was a fiction writer, I totally was willing to believe that writers of novels and short stories were universally noble people who were concerned about the whole human race, and they were using their writing to establish world peace and solve world hunger, whereas memoirs were self-absorbed navel-gazers. But in my own self-defense, I don't really believe that anymore. I think that it takes intense curiosity and generosity to write good memoir. You have to be willing to strip away those disguises if that's what it takes to reach insight and create connection. I think you also have to come to a basic acceptance that we're all really weird. And as you get older, you know, it really doesn't matter so much. It's like, yeah, I'm weird, so what? But you also have to come to the sort of paradoxical acceptance that you're not that weird, because if you've had any kind of thought or feeling or experience, there's somebody else in the world who's had it, and there's somebody else who will be really glad if you articulate it. You know, I'm always so happy when people articulate difficult things for me, and I'm like, yeah, just putting it into words is kind of comforting, hearing it kind of pinned down like that. So I realized that I've always used writing to process my experience, and when I first started writing creative nonfiction, fairly soon after I started writing it, I applied to adopt a baby from China. I think it's really, really amazing that I live in a time where I had the freedom to decide as a single woman to go to China and adopt a baby by myself and raise her by myself without any real stigma. I mean, that's a pretty radical thing when you consider that my great aunt had a baby out of wedlock in 1939, and it's still a source of such shame nobody in the family talks about it. You know, and here I am, like, I have so much freedom. So I was very excited that I got to do this thing, but it was also very lonely. I was living in rural South Carolina. I had no company in my process except for a conservative Christian adoption support group of married couples that live nearby. And what I do when I want company, when I want to feel like I'm not alone in something, is I go and I look for books. And so I went to look for books by other single people who had adopted from wherever, and there wasn't much there. Now that's changed in the last 10 years, quite a bit, but at the time I couldn't find much. And so I thought, you know, maybe I need to write this. So from very early in the process, I kept a journal thinking that maybe I would write a book. And that then evolved into my book, Meeting Sophie. I'm going to read a couple of brief excerpts from Meeting Sophie and then talk a little bit about my forthcoming book and read a little bit from that also. But let me just read a couple of brief parts of this. First day of Chinese class. Ping Ping starts with initials. She sings a sound at us. We sing back our attempts at imitation. Ba, she sings, and we reply. Ba. Pa, she sings, and we sing it back. And so on through ga and ka, ha, la, na, and then the finals. A, o, e, u, ow, ow, on. Yeah. We're a choir of Chinese consonants and vowels. Yeah, yeah, she sings. Yeah, yeah, we answer. Yeah, yeah, she tries again. Yeah, yeah, we don't miss a beat. Yeah, she says. Yeah, we sing back Chinese bebop. This is funny, she asks the sophomore. Smiles vanish. Yeah, yeah, we go on singing. Ping Ping focuses on us one at a time, waits for each solo echo. When she sings at me and I sing back, she pauses doubtfully, stares at me a second, and says finally, well, okay. Already I am failing to speak my child's language. Most people have till adolescence before the language barrier really kicks in. Next are the four tones. First tone is high-pitched. Ba, Ping Ping sings out. Ba, we repeat, a choir again, her obedient echo. Second tone. Ba, Ping Ping says, a question, her voice straining onto tiptoes. Ba, we repeat. Third tone. Ba, she says, a sound that falls into a hole but then crawls out. Ba, we repeat. I try not to dip my head. Fourth tone. Ba, she finishes, a definitive little jump, an exclamation point. Next is sound and tone discrimination. Ping Ping sings, we repeat. It's a lightning round of sounds. Bo, 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 bo. Bo, bo, pa, pa, ba, ba, pee, pee. Swiftly, we all form those sounds, our imperfect syllables. We sing each long note and then each staccato one, faster and faster, chorusing, then soloing on command, until I half expect us to burst into do a deer, a female deer, ray a drop of golden sun, and find ourselves whirling in the Alps wearing clothes made of old drapes. During the first week, Ping Ping reviews types of strokes, rising, falling, dot, hook. She shows a stroke order: horizontal before vertical, top to bottom, left to right, outside to inside. I try to write my name, but can't master the art of keeping strokes in proportion to each other. That's the point at which my work and my adoption paperwork get the best of me, and I give up on characters. But when Ping Ping speaks, when I study, I picture the tones, the syllables, the strokes. When I reach each new milestone in the paperwork process, I am giddy. My life is a fast and high-rising stroke zipping to the top of the page, a vapor trail looping behind a trick airplane. It is leaping and dancing all over the place, across the Alps, wearing old drapes. Although I ignore all the characters, I zealously throw myself into learning how to say, I am not a doctor, I am your mother, and here is the pictorial I borrowed. I am not a doctor sticks because busche, the equivalent of am not, sounds on the tape like bullshit. The guy on the tape, Goubeau, seems quite vehemently offended that anyone should mistake him for a doctor, pronouncing the words with clip precision. Well, busche daifu. I nudge one of my classmates, who also happens to be one of my own students. Does busche sound like bullshit to you? I ask. She looks a little shocked, then listens thoughtfully to a replay of the dialogue. Her face transforms. I doubt that she'll ever forget how to deny that she's a doctor either. Outside of class, I corner my fellow students and quiz them about the health and professions of their mothers, their fathers, their older brothers and younger sisters, their friends, their father's older sisters, and their mother's younger brothers. Due to vocabulary limitations, the only answers that my classmates can offer and that I can understand are, he, she is fine, he, she is not a doctor. Still, we speak regularly and continuously enough that bystanders look impressed. We decide to show off a little and start discussing the ownership of various books and pens. One day I am bragging about my newly acquired skills when a colleague interjects, but no one in China has brothers or sisters anymore. While this is not entirely true, the generation before the one-child policy do have siblings, as do many children whose parents are able to pay fines or who live in areas where enforcement is less diligent. My fervor takes a dive. When am I ever going to have the chance to return a pictorial I've borrowed from someone Chinese? And then one day, I turn the page of the Chinese text, and there is no more opinion, only characters. I am up Bushi Creek, so to speak. I'm also going to read just a brief excerpt from the part where I actually get the picture of my daughter for the first time. Pat calls with the name of my child. It turns out to be wrong, a miscommunication from the home office. Ni Chiano Chian, sounding more Hispanic than Chinese. At least I have taken enough Chinese to suspect that something is off. I call Sarah. Definitely not a Chinese name, Sarah says. I'm expecting my baby's name to mean something like beautiful flower or a lovely blossom, but the closest translation Sarah can find for Ni Chiano Chian is small fleck of rice in the front hall. Pat tells me that she will receive the FedEx package with my baby's picture in 2 days. I make an appointment to meet Pat at her office. For months, I've been walking down streets, watching little kids, thinking, could I love that baby? That one? Usually I've thought that I probably could. Then a couple from my adoption support group passed around pictures from their China trip, and I couldn't stop staring at this one poor baby with a Neanderthal forehead and an angry rash. Oh no, I thought, maybe not that one. So while I wait to see my baby's picture, I fret that she will be so peculiar looking that I'll never be able to bond with her. I scold myself for entertaining such a stupid fear, since I have often considered myself peculiar looking and ought to feel more natural affinity for a small fleck of rice in the front hall than a lovely blossom. When Pat passes me the paperwork, it turns out that my baby's name is Ni Chao Chen. Ni is a surname given to all the babies at that orphanage. It means a person or small child. Chao Chen means smart and musical. I relax a little. I'd much rather be mom to a smart and musical little person than a beautiful flower. I try not to snatch the tiny referral photo right out of Pat's hands. Ni Chao Chen is now 10 months old, and this picture was taken half her life ago. Wispy dark hair spikes above her fat, round face. Bundled in so many layers that her arms stick out on either side, she looks as if she's being prepared for crucifixion. I can't tell if she's trying to smile or work her mouth into a scowl, but the resulting expression is wise, knowing, and slightly challenging. She's a butterball with an attitude. Pat tries to hand me more papers, but I can't take my eyes off the photo, not so much mesmerized by the sight of my child, so much as dismayed, trying to contain my rising alarm, desperate to discern whether she has a neck. It's hard to distinguish anybody at all under the bulk of so many layers. The top one, a pink hand-knit sweater with orange, white, and black stitch-like stripes. On her collar, there's a doll head pin, round and grinning and lacking a neck, gruesomely reinforcing the illusion that the baby is also missing body parts. Her shoulders practically touch her ears, as if she is suited up to go out for the Iwu City Social Welfare Institute football team. Pat's trying to explain the process of applying for a visa, but I finally can't stand it. Are you sure she has a neck, I interrupt? She has a neck, Pat says. She's kind of funny looking, I say, aiming for an affectionate tone but striking a dubious one. I'm mostly disappointed, having expected my first glance of my child's picture to be a dramatic psychic experience. I thought there would be a sign that she would share a birthday with my mother, or that her name would be mine backward, or that she'd be called Soufui, something close to Sophie. She has pretty little features, Pat says. Are you sure her arms aren't growing out of her ears? I fight panic. Her arms are completely normal, Pat says firmly. I wonder if she's bluffing. How can she know for sure? I stare, willing myself to experience that lightning flash moment of irrevocable connection. Surely the awful clothes are grounds for empathy. As children, and I like to imagine somewhat against our wills, my brothers and I wore homemade double-knit polyester turtleneck t-shirts, 2 short pants with huge bell-bottoms, and matching overalls covered with big yellow happy faces. We didn't just wear them around the house either. We went to school and to the mall that way and to restaurants, and the fact that it was the 70s no longer seems to be much of an excuse. I examine the baby's expression, the face of this Ni Chao Chin, who I try to think of as Sophie, but it isn't working. She isn't a Sophie, she's a Ni Chao Chin. And she isn't my daughter, she's just some baby in a Chinese orphanage. Do you accept? Pat asks. Yes, I say, unable to picture myself as this baby's mom. I prop the picture on my steering wheel, puzzling all the way home at the idea that this baby is supposed to accompany me from China and live in my house. Well, obviously, I had some pretty silly fears, all of which I knew were silly at the time, fortunately. But it's interesting because I wrote the book, and a lot of people wrote to me, and I was surprised at how many people thanked me for being honest, for not telling another goopy story about adoption, but one that was honest and that admitted to negative feelings and doubts and confusion and all of that. There were also criticisms, people who wrote, like on Amazon, things like, well, how will her daughter feel about this someday? Her daughter will, think that she wouldn't have loved her if she wasn't pretty or whatever. And of course, her daughter will be hurt by her mother's doubts or negative thoughts. And of course, it turned out that all of that was completely ridiculous, and that, my daughter and I've talked many times about how it really wouldn't have mattered one bit what she looked like, or any of that stuff. That those were all my fears as a new mother. And it's interesting because it's come up in the context not of this book, but of her own fears of being a mother someday. She's really talking about that right now as a 12-year-old. She's like, I don't know if I want to have a baby. It sounds like it hurts. And she says things like, but Mom, what if my daughter isn't smart? What if my child what if my child's a boy? What if my child doesn't like to read? And I'm like, whatever your child is, you're going to love it, But I think those are natural doubts and fears, and I kind of hope she does have a boy, and then I'll get to have a grandson, since I never got to have a son. But all these things that she's worried about were the same kinds of things that everybody worries about. We worry about our own capacity to love, and it's amazing, what we find out about that. But one of the hardest questions for me is, writing about my daughter. Writing about people in general is a very difficult thing. But writing about my daughter, right now she's really, really happy to be part of my work. She was so excited when my new book got accepted. She met me at the door and she said, is the book about me? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, oh boy, she's so excited. And I'm thinking, oh, she's about to turn 13. How long is this going to last? But she has been a huge participant in the process of writing the new book. And this book, too, even though it's caused her to ask a lot of questions, she has a very positive sense of her own origins, a very strong sense of connection to China, and a huge amount of pride in her own story. And that might have happened without the book, but I know that the book has reinforced all that. So I think it's had some very positive effects, too. I wasn't going to write any more about my daughter after I published this book, but then I found myself writing essays periodically about our life together and about the things that I was discovering about raising a child from another culture, from another race, things I was discovering about adoption and what it means. And And so gradually I wrote various essays, and then gradually I thought, maybe this is a book. And so it kind of ended up evolving into a book also. And it's been a difficult process in some ways because I think that protective instinct you feel as a parent is sometimes at odds with that need as a writer to be honest about things. So my daughter has actually participated in the process, has read most of the book and given me feedback and told me when I needed to take things out because they would embarrass her, and actually was very helpful in saying, no, Mom, it didn't happen that way, you forgot this detail, remember blah, blah, and so she really helped me flesh out a lot of things. So my new book is called Crossing the Blue Willow Bridge, and the subtitle is A Journey to My Daughter's Birthplace in China. And the framework of the book is about our trip to China. It was a homeland tour, tours that are designed for, excuse me, whoa, for, excuse me, I knew that was going to happen. These are tours designed for children that have been adopted. Is this still working? Okay. And I lost my train of thought. Yes. And what I did was I used that as the framework for the book, but then interspersed throughout that are chapters that are drawn from the essays that I published that are about various issues having to do with international adoption. What I'm going to read from that book is the prologue. And so now it's 10 years later than what I just read you in Meeting Sophie. And she is 10 years old. And we have been on a trip. We've gone on the tour of China, and then our last stop is at the orphanage that she's from, where I've never been there before because they didn't allow us to go back when I adopted her. They brought her to me at a hotel. Okay. This is not going well. The orphanage director folds his hands on the table before him, his back so upright it doesn't touch the chair. His face remains unsmiling, inscrutable behind sunglasses he doesn't remove. He is not here, it turns out, because of his love of children. It is his poor eyesight that has doomed him to this position as director of the Chinese Welfare Institute where my daughter once lived. Mr. Lee first took his seat without introducing himself or welcoming us, and our interpreter, Grace, immediately fired off a question. Can we see my daughter's file, as promised by a previous director almost 10 years ago? I leaned forward, anxious. I planned to build to this subject over time, after a little friendly small talk. But now the question has bulleted across the table, and Mr. Lee responds with what sounds like a firm and final pronouncement. Neither Sophie nor I speak much Chinese. She has taken classes for a month and can say, "This is my nose." I took a class many years ago and retained little except the sentence, "I am not a doctor." Wabu shidaifu. I remember this so well because Gubo, the guy on the language tape, spat out the words as if furiously offended that anyone would dare to mistake him for a doctor. I can still imitate his tones and inflections, which I did a bit hesitantly for our guide in Beijing a few days ago when she asked me if I spoke any Chinese. I half expected her to rear back at my unnecessarily forceful rejection of the medical profession. But instead she looked impressed and made me repeat it for a guide at a soap factory, who also looked impressed. "We can understand you," they both said approvingly. Since then, Sophie and I have been proudly throwing around our Chinese, getting endless mileage out of this one sentence. I'd help people who are suffering, but wabu shidaifu, Sophie might announce casually, to which I'd reply, I would have started us on the antibiotics sooner, but wabu shidaifu. When it comes to Chinese, it's not just the words that I don't understand. I also have trouble deciphering moods and attitudes. Later, I will understand this better after reading in China's Survival Guide that while English has the same tones as Mandarin, how we intone a word in English doesn't completely change the definition of the word, only the feeling behind it. No wonder falling tones often come across to my American ears as vehemence, decisiveness, even anger, while rising tones sound like hesitation, uncertainty, or anxiety. The speaker could be saying, look at the beautiful white geese winging overhead, but if there are falling tones involved, I am likely to tense up and even feel mildly insulted. And if, in rising tones, someone said to me, this is a stick-up, put your hands in the air and don't make any sudden moves, I might very well be seized by an overpowering urge to pat him reassuringly and possibly fatally on the arm. So when Mr. Lee utters a few harsh syllables and shakes his head fiercely, I am instantly discouraged. Not Grace. She machine guns back a string of phrases. Mr. Lee responds at length. My daughter sags in the leather chair next to me, her mouth a network of wires and bands that are red this month in honor of China. She loves being in a country where she blends in, where no one stares at her. She tries not to smile too much, showing the braces that announce, in a country where dental care is often prohibitively expensive, that she is American. Her gaze drifts to the elaborate grates over windows that look out across a courtyard to the baby room where she once slept. She is zoning out at this important, long-awaited meeting, still recovering from the stomach bug that stranded us in Chengdu an extra day. Trying to stay alert for both of us, I listen intently as if I can follow the conversation. Grace speaks, Mr. Lee, Grace, Mr. Lee. I have become adept at watching Chinese soap operas and making up dialogue for Sophie's entertainment. Yesterday, a woman in a red negligee was clearly angry at her handsome bedmate. She delicately brushed a tear from her cheek while he removed a large rock from a hotel minibar and examined it. "Give me my rock back," she seemed to be pleading, or, "Please don't bash me with that rock." My daughter laughed and laughed. "Go on," she said. Now a negotiation appears to be unfolding, and hope fills me like a balloon rising over the shiny conference table, expanding, lifting, floating. Maybe Grace will coax out of Mr. Lee a piece of my daughter's past. But then Grace turns to us and reduces 10 minutes of conversation to 3 words. He says no. I release a pent-up breath. While hope spins away in a rapid, dizzily twirling gust, Grace says, with no transition, "Show him the picture." I'm not ready. So much rides on this picture. I haven't steeled myself yet for more pleaser arguments, head shakes, or buttoned lips. But I nod at Sophie, and she slides the picture, sealed in a Ziploc bag, across the table. It's us almost 10 years ago, me, a red-cheeked baby, and a man, a nameless man we've always referred to as the man. In the picture, we are all smiling. I'm ducking into the edge of the frame like an interloper. The man holds the baby and shakes a plastic rattle, a colorful cage, and closing jingle bells that bounce up and down. They make the music of an approaching sleigh. I've shown this picture to Sophie many times, telling her the story. The man, probably a member of the orphanage staff, had brought her to me on a train at my hotel in Hangzhou. She'd hung on to him tightly. Gently, he'd peeled her fist from his shirt and thrust her into my arms. Huge tears pooled in her eyes. As he retreated, her hands strained urgently toward him, fingers twitching, and I felt like a kidnapper. All night she howled operatically, her quick, dark eyes distrustful. In the morning, when the man came to say goodbye, she tucked her head joyfully into his shoulder. He jingled the rattle, and her laughter trilled, itself like little bells. The man was the one I wanted to talk to when the interpreter was free. "Who are you?" I wanted to ask. "Why are you so important to her?" But the man stepped aside for my interview with the orphanage director, filled with vague pleasantries about good sleeping habits and favorite foods. It became distressingly clear that he didn't know a single particular about my sleepless baby with only 2 teeth. Then, in the chaos of paperwork, baby foot and handprints stamped in ink on thin paper, an appearance before a judge in which I vowed to protect this baby and never abuse or abandon her, I lost sight of the man. Current laws in China mean that even if it were possible to track down birth parents, doing so could get them into trouble. So the story of the man may always be one of the only narrow threads we have connecting my daughter to her past. I've used the picture as my fragile bit of evidence that someone loved her the first few months of her life. Should we risk new information that might reconfigure this story? What if the man was a stranger who smelled familiar to her, like sticky white rice and jasmine tea and cigarettes? What if he was just some man who was good with babies? What if he is only a comforting myth I invented? After all, I have a picture of the orphanage staff that I have examined carefully, unable to find him. The orphanage director snaps a picture off the table like a playing card and deals it back to us with only a cursory glance. His answer is quicker this time. All the staff has changed in the last 10 years. The man's face is not familiar. And with that, it seems our quest is over. With that, finally and forever, our myths are intact, but so much I wished I could know has been lost. When my daughter first smiled, the first time she rolled over, crammed her fist in her mouth, laughed, cut a tooth, gripped a caretaker's finger and guided it to her mouth to slobber and gnaw. With the words of the orphanage director, all of those missing moments have been fully erased. At the other end of the table, laid out with plates of oranges and small, crisp green fruits like tiny apples, Mr. Yu, our driver, leaps up. He strides from the room. Cigarette break, I think. Mr. Lee waits in his characteristic formal silence for my next question. We are like unprepared hikers at high altitudes. My daughter's eyes glaze. I feel sluggish and droopy. I ask Sophie if she has any questions. She shakes her head. I don't know if she really doesn't, or if she's just too bored or intimidated to ask. I frame obligatory impersonal ones and avoid looking at my watch as I try to prolong the interview to a respectable length. It would seem impolite to show an interest, not to show an interest in the orphanage, even if the answers to my generic questions could probably be found online. How many children live in the orphanage? What are their ages? How many will be adopted? Where do the older ones go to school? What else can I ask, and how soon can we gracefully move on to visiting the baby room, leave to shop for items to donate, and return to our hotel? Mr. Lee answers each question briefly, without elaboration. Only 5 minutes have ticked by the time I run out of topics. Then, mercifully, Mr. Yu bursts back into the room. He speaks no more English than I do Chinese, but we understand some of his sign language. When he shakes his head at Sophie and encircles his wrist with his fingers, it's clear he's enjoining her to put some meat on her bones. When he works his fingers in the air, he's obviously suggesting improvement to her chopstick technique. When he pounds the steering wheel and unleashes a torrent of words, Sophie interprets under her breath. Move it, old man. Hey, lady, get out of the way. I'm guessing that she's pretty close, although there are probably also obscenities involved. I like the paternal affection he shows toward Sophie, telling her through her interpreter that she looks just like a Chinese pop star named Wei Wei. And now he's talking fast, smiling big enough to show his nicotine-stained teeth. The director stiffens. Grace blinks. Her eyes open wider. She leans forward. Sophie and I glance at each other, waiting for a translation, but now everybody's talking at once. We will just have to wait. A few days ago, on a soft sleeper train from Beijing to Xi'an, I woke early to quiet, only the sounds of the soft breaths of the other in the compartment, the rhythmic clicks of the train over rails. But then everyone began to stir, men waking and descending from the upper bunks, footsteps in the hall, compartment doors sliding open, voices, a seamless switch from peaceful silence and sleepy confusion to a chaos of activity. Whatever is going on now in the orphanage meeting room has nudged everyone into a similar state of wide-awake animation. They all pitch forward like passengers about to reach their station. Mr. Yu's words sizzle and crackle, sparklers and igniting Grace and even Mr. Lee, who are talking at the same time. Mr. Yu repeatedly pounds his arm with the heel of his hand. Sophie whispers, I think he's saying, cut off my arm, just cut off my arm. But it turns out that he does not require an emergency amputation, nor is he threatening to sacrifice a limb if the director doesn't try a little harder. It turns out that Mr. Yu has taken matters into his own hands and gone to talk to the staff. There's a disabled girl who grew up here, 10 or so when my daughter left, who helped care for her, who remembers her. And someone else identified the man. They know his wife. But the man and his wife have both retired to the countryside, far away. Grace sounds regretful. It is unlikely that we will find the man, she says. I had hoped to find out his name for future reference, but my expectations were low. I didn't really think we'd be able to meet him on this trip. I just thought if we had his name, we could track him down someday. Sophie stares dreamily at nothing, politely bored. Wait here, Grace says, and she and Mr. Yu and Mr. Lee retreat to an office down the hall. Soon they are back with a colorful laminated map and 4 more members of the staff. Everyone's interrupting, overlapping, gesturing, and peering over Mr. Yu's shoulder as he stabs at locations on the map and traces distances with his finger. It is very far, Grace says. Small worry lines furrow her brow. Do you really want to go look for the man? 3 months ago, my mother died. She collapsed while visiting me in Pennsylvania and spent a week in the hospital in Erie before flying home to a hospital in Kansas. Nurses came and went, velcroing bands around her arm while intently watching a dial, then reporting drops in blood pressure. 112/26, they'd say, matter-of-factly, as if this were normal. They brought small paper cups of water for her pills. They remembered, unlike the doctors, that she lived in Kansas. But I'll bet that if I went back now and asked them what they recalled about my mother, they would hem apologetically, reminding me how many patients they saw every day. So why would it be any different with orphanage workers who came and went 10 years ago, overtaxed workers who cared for 30 babies at a time? I wanted this trip to help Sophie feel connected to her past, but maybe just being here in China will have to be enough. The sense of belonging she feels that I can't fully understand. I take for granted the many souvenirs we have from my mother's life, her wedding ring, her thimble collection, and the memory of how soft her skin was when I hugged her, putting her on a plane 3 days before she died. Sophie whispered to me, "Odd, her skin is so soft." My mother, my aunt, my father, all gone now, proudly told stories about Sophie as a baby, laughed at her toddler antics, bragged about her elementary school achievements. I want it to be enough that she belongs to a family that has doted on her, that she and I share Grace as a middle name with my grandmother and my great-grandmother, that she is a part of my line now, set to inherit the crystal bowl passed down to all the Graces in my family. But the recent losses make it feel even more crucial to answer her questions about her past. It seems auspicious that the Western name of our interpreter here in Iwu is also Grace. Maybe my daughter will never know who her birth mother or birth father are, what they look like, what they have endured. But maybe, just maybe, there are other things she can know. So when Grace says, "Do you really want to go find the man?" and Sophie shifts out of her daydream to answer, "Yes," I nod my assent. And with that, the day spins entirely out of my control. We pile into the van, Sophie and me, Grace and Mr. Yu, and a young orphanage worker named Mr. Feng, who knows a shortcut. Infectious with laughter and anticipation and goodwill, we go careening down the highway so fast that my pictures out the window, even using the motion stabilizer, are blurred. This landscape is closer than any I've seen so far on this trip to my childhood image of China, which came straight from the Blue Willow China pattern. On the plates, a path leads to a pagoda with a curved roof. Doves hover in the sky, a crooked fence zigzags along, and 3 people cross a bridge. I love that picture the way I could feel the shade of the willows, hear the bubbling of the stream, be calmed by the suggestion of mist, of peace, of the bright blue sky and ocean. It was like a picture you could walk right into and be at home. So as we fly down the highway, I snap picture after picture, recording this countryside that feels at once familiar and foreign. Rows of small colored flags flying from roofs, bikes pulling wooden wagons, road workers in wide-brimmed straw hats, mulberry, camphor, and willow trees, fields of sugarcane and rice, red lanterns hanging from stores, farmers' houses with towers and turrets and shiny windows, carefully detailed and freshly painted, looking cut from gingerbread. And ducks on a pond, haystacks tied at the top like a witch's broom, an occasional pagoda on a hill, mountains folding over each other in the distance. Dusty heat blows through the van and everyone shouts words I don't understand with the cadence and volume and pitch I do, words wrought with a touching eagerness to offer something to this skinny American girl in braces and a faded t-shirt from a gymnastics meet. For an hour, Mr. Yu zips along the highway and brakes abruptly and erratically in traffic. He forces the van between 2 cars as confidently as if our vehicle were a motorbike. The cars part to create a 3rd lane on the 2-lane highway. We bounce along in our newly created lane, off on an adventure or maybe a fool's errand, in search of a mythical face in a picture, someone who might remember the girl nodding off in the back seat, a man who once loosened her small hand from his shirt and placed it gently in my hand as if to say, "Here, she is yours now," while his eyes flickered as if with regretful determination. Based on expressions and gestures I might have misread, based on a baby's giggle and grip 10 years ago, we are flying down the highway to locate a stranger, veering down another road and into the countryside in search of the man. And that's the end of the prologue. Then you have to wait to chapter 8 to find out what happens. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yes.
Willow myth, and do you get into that in the book about what it really means and the story behind it? Because your first impression is so peaceful and so sort of glossed over.
I don't do a whole lot with it except, I mean, it basically was my image of China, and I think that that image, of course, has become far more complicated over the years, and especially since I have a daughter from China. I did think it was very interesting that that the Blue Willow pattern originated in China but did not have the bridge, they don't think, originally on it with the people on it. That was something that was added by the British, whoever it was that actually then made the design from the Chinese pattern. So the design itself is kind of a hybrid one, much like my family is. You know, it's a hybrid one of 2 different cultures. And of course, that whole idea of the bridge and the idea that what we're doing by, I mean, homeland trips have become a kind of rite of passage for people who adopt from China. And from other countries too, but especially it's become this huge industry for companies that do tours in China to design things specifically for kids to get to know their birth country. And so it really struck me on the trip that what we're trying to do, I mean, they're never going to feel, my child is never going to feel like a native. She doesn't speak, I mean, she will learn more Chinese as the years go on, but she'll probably never speak fluent Chinese. And, you know, I think that our goal as adoptive parents is to just sort of build a bridge so that our children can cross it someday and feel comfortable in that country and able to be comfortable with people from their own native culture and, be curious about it, want to learn about it their whole lives. So, it was more of a metaphorical thing than really dealing with the whole myth of it. Anything else? Yes?
So what did Sophie discover? What are some of the things that she discovered that changed her or didn't change her?
Mm-hmm. She was determined to love China. And it was sort of funny because the first few days we were there, she has asthma and she was just coughing like crazy because there's so much cigarette smoke everywhere. We had no smoking hotel rooms, but it would say no smoking and it would have dire warnings all over the room, but then it would have an ashtray. So obvious, and there'd be ashtrays out by the elevators and there was cigarette smoke in the air because a lot of businessmen in China especially smoke. And she kept, she's coughing away and she's having to use her inhaler and she's like, oh, I love China, hack, 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 I mean, she didn't want to criticize anything about it, which, I think it was so important to her it affirmed her identity in some way. And so I think that, I guess when I first took her there, I wanted her to have that love of the country that she was from. I really wanted her to have that connection. But I think a part of me also wanted her to see it in more realistic ways because she idealized everything about China. And I wanted her to see maybe the bigger picture. And some of the time when we were traveling, I wasn't sure that she did because she was just like, oh, everything is so wonderful, everything is perfect, And but I think that her just inevitably, her picture of it did become more complex. And it's certainly by no means negative, and I didn't want it to be negative, but I wanted her to see the range of, like, it's a beautiful and ancient culture, but then there are various aspects of it that are also, maybe not so beautiful, like with any culture. So that was a really big thing. I think just, learning more about China and seeing it, like physically seeing a place that she had dreamed about. She's seen pictures of it, but I think actually being there is so different. And we had spent a lot of time going to Asian festivals and going to Chinese New Year celebrations, and they seemed so pathetic once we were in China, just standing there on the street, like with all the stuff surrounding us, and like going, oh my gosh, these little efforts we made are so small in comparison to just being here. So I think she became really comfortable with, or far more comfortable with the idea of international travel, like really excited about travel. She wants to go everywhere now. She wants to go back to China, but we also spent some time in Spain, and she just loved that. And she just loves being around different kinds of people and hearing different languages. And then, of course, in the book I talk about, we actually were able to meet this man, which I think meant a lot to her. And then we were quite surprised that we were taken to the village where she was born. I didn't know what was going on. And it finally dawned on me what was happening. And that was just amazing for her to see where she was from. So, I think that in some ways, I read a lot of testaments, that people who had taken their children were like, we came back and my child was utterly changed. And, I read some of those to my daughter and she's like, I've been touched by Jesus. She's making fun of me. I didn't see radical changes, but I think that gradually, I see differences in how comfortable she is with her identity and how enthusiastic she is about things. So I think I'm still discovering some of the effects. Yeah?
You spoke in one of your essays about some of the cruel things that other children might say to Sophie, things like, how much did your mom pay for you and stuff. Does she still get that kind of thing? And if she does she handle it better, maybe based on?
She's always handled it really well. I'm just awed, and gets these questions, and she hasn't faced anything different from most. But the other day she came home and she said, Mom, somebody in my class was doing the Chinese-Japanese thing and pulling their eyes, and I said, well, what did you do? She's in 7th grade now, and she said, I gave him the finger. She said, is that okay? And I said, yeah. Don't do that. Normally don't do that, but you have every right to defend yourself, and I will back you up if you're in trouble for that. Because if the school's not dealing with it, then you deal with it, right? So, she's pretty good about dealing with this stuff, and probably in a different way than I would, but hey, it seemed to work. So, yeah.
I have a question about the writing process.
Oh,
You know, did you have a special time and place to write? Did you discuss it with Sophie when you were, did you have a writer's group? And also, how you found your publisher for it?
Okay, those are a lot of questions, and
Yeah.
so remind me. As far as writing habits, I actually, at one time, thought that I absolutely had to have this kind of pen, and I had to have this kind of pad, and I had to write during this time of the day, in this particular location, with this particular music playing, or I couldn't write. And I did that for years, and I really felt that that's what I had to have. And then I had Sophie, you know, and she was always interrupting me, and so I had to switch to writing in the morning, and gradually I switched to writing on the computer. And my dog keeps eating my pens, so I can't keep those nice pens. So basically, all my habits have changed, and I think it was so ingrained finally that it doesn't matter. I just need to write, you know. And at one time, I would look forward all day to that evening time when I'd get to write, and now I look forward to those mornings that I get to write. So as far as that goes, I think that if you can make it a habit, then it just becomes something you need to do, and you can pretty much do it anywhere and in any way. What was the other, what else? Writers group. Actually, I don't, and I wish I did. I live in a pretty isolated place. I don't know that many writers there. I mean, I know lots of writers elsewhere. I really crave face-to-face interaction, so I do have people that will give me feedback, you know, when I need it, long distance, and that's wonderful and very helpful. But I have not found it. I think a face-to-face writers group would be really great, and I'm actually working on that because I know a couple people who are serious where I live. But I totally recommend them. I think it's really, really important to get feedback from other people before you submit. And then you also asked, yeah, I actually sent the manuscript around to commercial publishers for a while, and agents, and mostly what I was getting was, well, we think the audience maybe is too narrow for this, and maybe you want to go with a smaller press. So finally I said, okay, and I wrote to Missouri, and they said, yeah, we'd like to see it, and I sent it to them. So they were the first small press I wrote to, and they took it, but it was after a long time of writing to other people. And so basically with the most recent book, I just wrote to them and said, hey, do you want this? Because I didn't want to spend forever trying to find agents and publishers. I wanted to just get it published and really focus on the marketing stuff, which writers have to do so much of these days. And then the other question was that it? Oh, okay. Okay, I thought I missed something. Okay, yeah. And you had a question also?
Actually, I was going to ask you also some of those same questions, but I also wanted to know, you mentioned that you were keeping a journal in anticipation of writing the book, and I wondered if you could speak about the difference between the journal writing and then actually sitting down and writing the book.
Yeah.
Will you repeat the question?
The question is that I kept while I was preparing to write the book and preparing to adopt my daughter. What did I do then when I sat down to write the book with that journal, basically? And you know, it's been so long since I wrote the book. It's really sort of funny because I keep going, wait, what did I do? But I think that actually originally I was going to write it in the form of a journal. The whole book was, and I was going to polish up the journal and take stuff out that, you know, and try to keep the most interesting parts. But what happened is that when we were in China, I had just done the paperwork. I'd just gotten Sophie, and we'd done the paperwork, and she was mine, basically. But that was when NATO bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and there were all these protests that erupted throughout China, and we didn't know what was going on at the time. I only gradually found out that there were all these protests, and that the White Swan Hotel, which everybody goes to at the end of their trip, their adoption trip, because it's right by the U.S. Embassy, where you get your visa, that protesters had swarmed the White Swan, that it was dangerous for Americans to be out on the streets. I knew none of that. You know, we were like in this area where I had just done the paperwork for my daughter, and we were supposed to fly to Guangzhou, where the embassy is, the next day. And I knew something weird was going on, and I was hearing bits and pieces, but my agency would not tell us. And my cousin, Jody, kept watching the news, and she actually found stations, English language stations, that told us what was going on, or we wouldn't have known. And so then we had to ride through Guangzhou in a curtained bus so that, you know, it concealed that it was holding Americans, because there were protesters everywhere lining all the roads. And then we basically were under police orders not to leave the hotel. But I discovered that the journal wouldn't work anymore because I found out so much stuff after the fact. I didn't find out a lot of it until I got back to the US and read newspaper articles. I didn't know that people were frantically calling my relatives trying to find out where I was. I didn't know that it was that big a deal because I figured that, like, basically nobody I knew paid attention to the news. I thought they were all pretty self-involved, and, you know. And so I was just like, yeah, whatever, you know. And we actually were sort of sped through the process. The embassy was closed because people were like throwing rocks to the windows and stuff. So the embassy officials came over and processed us at the hotel, and we left immediately. We'd been planning to stay an extra day. So, so we basically, I mean, I missed a lot. I didn't know what was going on, and I couldn't put it in journal form, and there was no dramatic way to report it without turning the story, the whole story, into a narrative. And so I actually switched the whole journal form because of that one thing, because I wanted to be able to report what was going on. And it wouldn't have been authentic in a journal because part of the point was that my agency was withholding that from us. So basically, I just tried to take the journal and to turn it into a more dramatic story. And honestly, I think that was probably the wise choice because I think the journal form in this particular case was maybe a little bit too plodding. And so, yeah. When we were in China with my daughter when she was 10. Yeah, actually, we signed up for this tour, but it was right after the Olympics and right when the economy crashed, and so everything was really expensive in China, and nobody could afford to go. But I had been planning it for years and saving money for years, and I had a sabbatical, and I had to go at that point. So we went ahead and went, even though we were the only people that signed up for the tour. And so it was disappointing in a way because we wanted to meet other people in our situation, and I thought it would have been fun to see the whole experience through the eyes of you know, more children. But and I think that Sophie would have liked that too. But we ended up having our own sort of private tour, and so we ended up having a lot more flexible time and being able to go places that we wanted to go to. And she loved that. You know, she loved just being able to walk up and down streets. And we're actually going back to China this summer and renting an apartment for a month just so that she can have that experience of being there because she loved it so much. And I did too. I thought it was nice not to be on a schedule sometimes. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
I just wanted to ask, in writing the book, the last book, Crossing the Blue Willow Bridge, what were the challenges for you? You'd already written The Flashlight Man, but that was a different kind of memoir, but you'd already written this. So presumably you've gotten really good at what you're doing. What were some of the new challenges that you discovered?
I think the biggest challenge was probably, what I did was the framework of the book is our trip to China, but then I had published over the years that I wanted to integrate as background, and so really trying to find a way to integrate those and make it a continuous narrative, something that everything went together. I wrote the book really, really fast compared to the other books, which I labored over for years and years and years, and this book, I basically wrote it, got it finished, wrote to Missouri, asked if they wanted it, they read it, they said yes. They said you have 2 months to revise it, and we're still waiting to do the full editing process, but I know I'm going to want to change a lot of things because I had to do the revision so fast. Every time I look back at it, I'm like, oh, I got to change that, oh, I got to change that. So I think it was just a matter of, it's been a really different process because I did revise it so quickly, and write it and revise it so quickly. It was also a challenge to figure out how to use source material because I really wanted to do some research on adoption-related issues and integrate that into the piece. And everybody who read, including Jody, I had 4 people read the book when Missouri accepted it and give me feedback. And every one of them said, oh, you're really changing tones when you talk about this research. And I had put footnotes in just really so I could keep track of the research, not because I really expected the book to have footnotes. But I think it was lending it a really kind of academic tone in places. So it was sort of a challenge how to deal with that source material. And my publisher eventually just asked me to put like a section at the end, a note about the sources, and just, not footnote anything. So, but that was kind of challenging too, just figuring out how to do that, because I'd never really used a lot of research before like that.
Do you have another project now?
Oh yes, I always have a zillion. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. The things that they requested seemed to me pretty minor compared to what I wanted to do to it at the time. There were some really good suggestions, but I really can't remember what they were, because I was like, oh my God, I have to overhaul this. I'm not happy with this at all. I would say that my readers gave me more suggestions than what the publisher did. I think they would have they liked the book and they probably would have taken it. There were places where they felt like the pacing was off and they wanted me to do something about that, and I think they were absolutely right. And I worked on that. But I felt like they were a little easy on me in some places, and that I really needed to work harder to integrate some of the essays, and that I needed to do more with some parts of the book to flesh them out. So, it's kind of, it's a little unsettling, because, it was all in my hands to, I'm hoping that the editor who is working on it will have other suggestions so that, I can make sure that it's where I want it to be. Yeah.
Daughter involved working, writing, when she's gone to up the stage.
Yeah, she asked for examples of how my daughter has participated in of writing this stuff. And when we were in China, when we were traveling through China, we both kept journals, and every night we would read our journals to each other. She loved that. It made me write more, because she would say, write about this, write about that, and I would read it to her. And I'm trying to remember. The things that they requested seemed to me pretty minor compared to what I wanted to do to it at the time. There were some really good suggestions. But I really can't remember what they were, because I was like, oh my God, I have to overhaul this. I'm not happy with this at all. I would say that my readers gave me more suggestions than what the publisher did. I think they would have they liked the book and they probably would have taken it. There were places where they felt like the pacing was off and they wanted me to do something about that, and I think they were absolutely right. And I worked on that. But I felt like they were a little easy on me in some places, and that I really needed to work harder to integrate some of the essays, and that I needed to do more with some parts of the book to flesh them out. So, it's kind of, it's a little unsettling, because, it was all in my hands to, I'm hoping that the editor who is working on it will have other suggestions so that, I can make sure that it's where I want it to be. Yeah.
Daughter involved working, writing, when she's gone to up the stage.
Yeah, she asked for examples of how my daughter has participated in of writing this stuff. And when we were in China, when we were traveling through China, we both kept journals, and every night we would read our journals to each other. She loved that. It made me write more, because she would say, write about this, write about that, and I would read it to her, and she would laugh. She's a great audience. She laughs in all the right places. And she would say, oh, Mom, you forgot this, you forgot that, or what about this? And so it was really helpful. It kept me going on the journal. And then when I actually wrote the book, I made her sit there and listen to parts of it. I made her read parts of it. I'd be reading, and she'd be like, Mom, this is boring. Can you skip? Because, there were parts that were about adoption issues that she really wasn't that interested in at this point. So I tried to skip through to places that I thought she'd be more interested in, where she was more present, so she could give me feedback. And she'd say, oh, Mom, that's embarrassing. Take that out. Or oh, you forgot this. Be sure and describe this. Or do you remember that man who did that? And so most of it was her listening to various parts of the book and then giving me suggestions for things to add, or saying, you've got to take this out, or you got that totally wrong. So she's actually very, very helpful. Oh, yeah.
You talked about the adoption issues.
Mm-hmm.
What was your finding, and make some brief comment on that?
What kinds of research did I do? Yeah.
What kind of issues?
What kind of issues? Yeah. There's several different things that I wanted to talk about. including, I mean, I don't think you can write about international adoption without talking about these many programs have had in many countries, especially that have come to light in recent years, that have to do with child trafficking, and there have been situations in China. There's a lot of controversies involving international adoption. We went to a conference once that was in contrast. If you go to adoption group meetings and conferences, adoptive parents tend to be very warm and fuzzy, and adoption is like, you know, we do consider adoption to be this amazing, great thing, you know, it's done these amazing things for our lives. We were so lucky. But there's the flip side that many children, I mean, you know, a lot of kids really want to know who their birth parents are. So there's a lot of difficult issues that I think don't get addressed by or haven't historically been addressed by adoptive parents. There's been a lot of vilifying of birth parents. So I really wanted to deal with that, to talk about the way we treat birth parents, the way we think of them, the political situations and economic and cultural situations that you know, create these kinds of situations. Basically, I tried to touch on all the controversies that I'm trying to think, there's a couple other things. That, you know, center on international adoption. Oh, we went to this one conference that was an academic conference, and there were adoptees who were adults who were going around stopping adoptive parents and asking them how they could possibly justify what they had done, you know, adopting interracially when, you know, some people consider it a kind of cultural genocide. And I think you have to address those issues. However you feel about them, you have to address them if you're going to be an adoptive parent, because your child's going to raise questions about these things someday. So that kind of stuff.
Any other questions? I know that Nancy would be thrilled to answer your foreheads, as the case may be. Please join me in thanking Nancy for being here. See you in 2 weeks.